After more than 30 years in this cockpit, I've learned that every country has a voice. Not a voice you hear through headphones or TC frequencies. I mean a voice you feel. A kind of presence that rises up from the earth and finds you at 35,000 feet, even before you've crossed the border. Some countries whisper. Some hum. Mexico. Mexico shouts at you. It grabs you by the collar and says, asterisk, look at me, asterisk. And I've been looking for 3 decades, and I still haven't seen everything. I remember the very first time I flew into Mexico. I was a young first officer, 28 years old, still figuring out which end of the approach was which, and we were coming in from the north, descending toward Monterey on a clear winter morning. I had my face practically pressed against that side window, like a kid at a candy shop. Down below, the Sierra Madre Oriental was catching the first light of the day, all rust and amber and deep shadow. These weren't gentle hills. These were walls. Great tilted walls of stone draped in forest, and between them, valleys so green they almost looked painted. I turned to my captain, a man named Rogers, veteran of 20 years, and I said, I had no idea. And he just smiled and said, nobody does. That's the thing about Mexico. Nobody ever does. 30 years later, I understand exactly what he meant. Let me set the scene for you today. We are flying southbound, somewhere over the state of Chihuahua, and the land below is doing what it does best in northern Mexico. It is being vast and uncompromising and brutally, magnificently beautiful. The Chihuahuan Desert stretches in every direction as far as the eye can follow. It is the largest desert in North America, though most people couldn't tell you that if you asked. They think of the Sonoran or the Mojave, but no, this is the big one. From up here, it looks like the surface of a planet that hasn't quite decided whether it wants to be Mars or Earth. Dry riverbeds trace silver lines through the scrubland. The occasional mountain range erupts without warning, folded and twisted like crumpled paper. And somewhere down in all that emptiness, there are towns, villages, ranches, people going about their lives under that enormous sky. I've always found the north of Mexico underappreciated. Travelers think of beaches and ancient ruins and street tacos, which are all absolutely valid. But the north is a frontier in the old sense of the word. Rugged, self-reliant, enormous. The state of Chihuahua alone is larger than the United Kingdom. Think about that for a moment. One Mexican state, bigger than an entire country that once ruled a quarter of the world. Mexico has 31 states and a federal entity in Mexico City, and many of them carry that same staggering scale. Flying at cruising altitude, I can sometimes see 3 or 4 states simultaneously. The curvature of the Earth becomes a companion at this height. You start to understand the planet differently. You understand why empires rose and fell trying to hold territories like this. You understand the ambition it took for the Spanish to come here in the 16th century and look at all this, and say, asterisk, we will govern this asterisk. It's audacious to the point of madness, frankly. We're crossing into Durango now, and I want to tell you about Mexican geography for a moment, because it matters for everything else. Mexico sits at the junction of multiple tectonic plates, the North American, the Cocos, the Rivera, the Caribbean. The land is geologically restless. It has always been restless. This isn't just a metaphor for the culture, though it works as one. It is literally true that the ground beneath Mexico is in a constant state of slow negotiation with itself. Earthquakes are a fact of life. Volcanoes are not curiosities, they are neighbors. The Trans-Mexican Volcanic Belt runs east to west across the middle of the country like a spine made of fire. Popocatépetl, Iztaccíhuatl, the Pico de Orizaba, which is the 3rd highest peak in North America, and which I have had the extraordinary privilege of seeing from the air on several dozen occasions. When conditions are right, clear air, low humidity, the right angle of approach, you can see Pico de Orizaba from a very long way out. It rises to over 5,500 meters, and it carries a glacier on its shoulders like an old coat. A glacier in Mexico. Most people are surprised by that. They shouldn't be. Mexico contains multitudes. I think about the people who came before all of this, before airports and flight plans and GPS, and I try to imagine what it was like to navigate this landscape on foot. The ancient people of Mexico were not just surviving in this terrain, they were mastering it, building with it, drawing meaning from it. Every mountain was a god or a god's home. Every river had a name and a story. The volcanoes, especially the ones you can see from the Central Plateau, were part of the cosmological architecture of civilizations that lasted centuries. We're beginning our descent now toward the Central Highlands, and I need to tell you about the approach to Mexico City because it is one of the most extraordinary experiences in commercial aviation. I'm not being sentimental. I'm being factual. Ask any pilot who has done it. The approach in the Benito Juarez International Airport, or NAICM, as the newer facility is known, is an experience that will rewire something in your brain. Mexico City sits in a basin, the Valley of Mexico. It's surrounded on almost all sides by mountains and volcanoes, and it sits at an elevation of roughly 2,240 meters above sea level. That is more than 7,300 feet. You are already at altitude before you've left the ground. The air is thin. The engines work differently. The performance calculations are different. The go-around margins are different. Everything demands more respect, more precision, more forethought. And then there's the city itself. I have flown into more than 80 countries in my career. I have approached cities on every continent. I have seen Tokyo from the air, and Cairo, and Sao Paulo, and Lagos. And none of them, not one, has ever prepared me for the first proper look at Mexico City from the flight deck on a clear day. It is not a city. It is a civilization. It spreads across that basin like an ocean that has decided to become urban. 22 million people, give or take, depending on how you draw the boundaries. The greater metropolitan area is one of the largest human agglomerations on the face of the earth. And from the air, you can feel its gravity. It pulls at you. The grid of streets extends in every direction until it meets the mountains. And then it climbs the mountains because it cannot stop, because there are always more people and always more need for space. Favelas and colonias cling to hillsides that look barely navigable on foot. Then you descend through the murk, because yes, there is often murk. The combination of altitude and emissions and geography creates a persistent haze, and the city resolves itself into something. Human, traffic, markets, church steeples, parks, and then the runway, and then the wheels, and then you are inside it. Every time I land in Mexico City, I feel like I've docked at a space station. The scale is so different from normal human experience. The noise, the energy, the smell of the place when you step outside, diesel and corn and something floral, always something floral, because this city has flowers everywhere. It hits you all at once. But I want to go back up now, because there's something I haven't told you yet. Something you can see from the air that most people who visit Mexico City never bother to seek out. And it is, in my personal and very experienced opinion, the single most striking thing you can observe from a commercial aircraft window anywhere on this planet. Teotihuacan, about 50 kilometers northeast of Mexico City Center. If your flight path takes you over the basin at the right angle, and if visibility is cooperating, you can see them. The pyramids. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon, connected by the Avenue of the Dead. All of it laid out in a geometric precision that from the air looks almost impossible. Not impossible in the way that makes you disbelieve it. Impossible in the way that makes you feel the full weight of human ambition and human capacity across the centuries. Teotihuacan was not built by the Aztecs. I want to be clear about that, because the confusion is common. By the time the Aztecs rose to prominence in the 14th and 15th centuries, Teotihuacan had already been abandoned for some 700 or 800 years. The Aztecs found it, explored it, named it Teotihuacan in Nahuatl, means roughly the place where the gods were created, or the place where men become gods, depending on the translation, and they were in as much awe of it as we are. They built their own mythology around it. They claimed it as a sacred inheritance, even though they had no direct connection to whoever built it. Who built it? We are still not entirely certain. The city at its height, around the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, was one of the largest in the world, perhaps 125,000 people or more. It had apartment complexes, actual multifamily housing with common courtyards. It had a market district, a religious district, a craft quarter. It was cosmopolitan in the truest sense. People came from as far as Oaxaca and the Gulf Coast and the Maya lowlands to live and trade and worship there. And then, around 550 AD, it burned. Evidence of deliberate destruction. Fire concentrated on the monumental buildings, the palaces of the elite. It may have been revolution. It may have been external conquest. It may have been both. The city declined over the following centuries and was eventually abandoned. And there it sat in the highlands of central Mexico for 1,000 years, while dynasties rose and fell around it, while the Aztecs came and went, while the Spanish arrived and built their churches on top of Aztec temples, while the Mexican nation was born and struggled and survived. And it is still there. From the air, I can tell you that it looks eternal. The scale of the Pyramid of the Sun, 65 meters high, 220 meters on each side at the base, is large enough to be clearly visible from cruising altitude if conditions allow. I've pointed it out to passengers over the intercom a few times when the visibility was exceptional. The response from the cabin is always the same, a kind of collective intake of breath. Then quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that means people are actually thinking. Now, let me take you somewhere else. Let me take you southeast, over Puebla, a city of Baroque architecture and mole sauce in a battle fought on the 5th of May, 1862, that the rest of the world misunderstands completely, and then further south into Oaxaca. Oaxaca from the air looks like a place that time is still negotiating with. The Sierra Juarez and the Sierra de Mayahuatlan converge here, and the valleys between them contain some of the oldest continuously inhabited agricultural land in the Americas. Monte Alban, the great Zapote capital, sits on a flattened mountain above the city of Oaxaca. Somebody looked at that mountain, a natural peak in a valley of natural peaks, and decided to level the top of it and build a city there. This was not a casual undertaking. This was a statement. We are here. We have shaped this mountain. We will endure. Monte Alban was occupied for more than 1,000 years. It was one of the first cities in Mesoamerica. The Zapotecs who built it had their own writing system, their own calendar, their own astronomical knowledge, their own political sophistication. When you fly over Oaxaca and you can see that plateau in the distance, you are looking at evidence of a civilization that was already ancient when Rome was still debating what kind of government it wanted to be. I spent a lot of time in this cockpit thinking about time. Not in a morbid way, in an odd way. The compression of it. How thin the atmosphere is. How thin the layer of time in which all of human history has occurred. 35,000 feet below me right now, someone is probably grinding corn the way their grandmother taught them. Someone is probably tending a milpa, that ancient three-crop system of corn, beans, and squash that sustained civilizations for millennia, and is still practiced in the mountains of Oaxaca and Chiapas today. The continuity is staggering. The persistence of human culture across catastrophe and conquest and time. Let me talk about the Mayans, because no flight over Mexico is complete without them. And because they deserve more than the 30 seconds they usually get in conversations about ancient history. The Maya civilization was not a single empire with a single capital and a single ruler. It was a collection of city-states, some large, some small, all sophisticated, spread across what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Mexican states of Chiapas, Tabasco, Campeche, Yucatan, and Quintana Roo all contain major Maya sites. From the air over the Yucatan Peninsula, the land looks deceptively flat and green. The peninsula is a great limestone shelf, and it is riddled with caves and cenotes, natural sinkholes that form when the limestone ceiling of an underground river or cave collapses. The Maya considered cenotes sacred. They were portals to the underworld, to Xibalba, the realm of the death gods. They were also, critically, the primary source of fresh water in a region with no surface rivers. Religion and practicality intertwined, as they so often are when you look honestly at ancient civilizations. Chichen Itza sits roughly in the center of the Yucatan Peninsula. When you are on approach to Cancun and you look west on a clear day, you are looking in the direction of it, though you likely cannot see it through the forest cover. The Great Pyramid of El Castillo, formerly the Temple of Kukulkan, is a calendar in stone. Each of its 4 sides has 91 steps, and when you add the top platform, you get 365. The number of days in the solar year. At the spring and autumn equinoxes, the setting sun casts a shadow along the pyramid's northern staircase that creates the illusion of a serpent descending from the summit to the earth. This was deliberate. The Maya were among the most accomplished astronomers of the ancient world, and they encoded their knowledge of the sky into their architecture. I think about that when I'm using my navigation systems. GPS, inertial reference, VOR, ILS, all of this technology in my hands. And the Maya were tracking the movements of Venus with naked eye observations precise enough to predict its appearances centuries in advance. Different tools. The same human drive to understand where we are in space and time. I find that connection deeply moving, honestly. The Maya writing system, one of the few fully developed writing systems in pre-Columbian America, was largely deciphered in the latter half of the 20th century. What was once mysterious glyphs carved in the stone stele can now be read. What the stele say, mostly, are histories, dynastic records, accounts of battles and alliances, marriages and ritual, sacrifice and celestial observation. The Maya were obsessed with history, with recording it, with legitimizing power through it, with connecting the present to the mythological past. In that, they were not so different from any human civilization you care to name. Let me descend for a moment from the ancient and talk about the living. Because Mexico is not a museum. Mexico is a furiously alive, complex, frustrating, generous, creative, contradictory country of over 130 million people, and no flight over it is complete without acknowledging that. The cultural richness of Mexico is frankly difficult to overstate. Let me try anyway, because that's why we're here. Mexico has 35 sites on the UNESCO World Heritage List. 35. That puts it among the top 10 countries in the world for UNESCO heritage recognition. But the list barely scratches the surface. For every officially recognized site, there are 100 unremarkable-looking corners of unremarkable-looking towns where something extraordinary happened or is still happening. Take music. Mexico has a musical tradition of staggering depth and diversity. Mariachi, which most of the world knows, is actually a relatively young form, 19th century, from the state of Jalisco. But underneath it are dozens of regional traditions. Son Jarocho from Veracruz, Son Huasteco from the Gulf Coast Highlands, the banda brass bands of Sinaloa, the marimba traditions of Chiapas and Oaxaca, indigenous musical traditions that predate Spanish contact by centuries, and then the ways all of these have interwoven with each other and with African and Caribbean and European influences over 500 years of colonial and post-colonial life. I have had the pleasure of hearing live music in cantinas and cities I've overnighted in across Mexico, and I can tell you that there is something in the Mexican relationship with music that is different from what I've encountered elsewhere in the world. Music is not entertainment here. It is expression. It is philosophy. When a musician in an Oaxacan bar looks at you and starts playing, they are telling you something. The eyes are always telling you something. Mexican cuisine is also on the UNESCO list, specifically traditional Mexican cuisine as a piece of intangible cultural heritage. It was the first cuisine to receive that recognition. And it deserves it, not because of the flavors alone, but because of what it represents. The cuisine of Mexico is the physical manifestation of the encounter and collision and eventual synthesis of indigenous and European food traditions. The chili is pre-Columbian. The pork is colonial. The chocolate is ancient Mesoamerican. The cheese is Spanish. What you get on a plate at a good Mexican restaurant is 500 years of history, served warm. I always eat local when I have a layover in Mexico. Always. I've had some of the most extraordinary meals of my life in Mexican cities. Not in fancy restaurants, in markets. In those covered markets where the women running the stalls have been perfecting their recipes for 40 years, and they know things about the relationship between dried chilies and thyme that no culinary school could teach. I had a mole negro in Oaxaca once, a sauce made with more than 30 ingredients, including chocolate and charred chili skins, which had been cooking for 2 days, that I still think about. I have eaten in France. I have eaten in Japan. That mole stands up. I want to take you to the coast now, because Mexico has 2 of them, and both deserve attention. On the Pacific side, we are looking down at a coastline that runs more than 7,000 kilometers if you follow all the bays and inlets. The Pacific coast of Mexico is geologically active. Remember those tectonic plates? And it shows. The coastline is dramatic in the way that active geology tends to produce. Cliffs, sea stacks, deep bays backed by jungle-covered mountains that drop almost directly into the water. The states of Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas offer some of the most visually striking coastal approaches I have ever flown. When I'm coming into Huatulco or Puerto Escondido in the right season, with the offshore breeze pushing clean air in from the Pacific and the mountains catching the late afternoon light, I sometimes have to remind myself to focus on the instruments. The Gulf Coast is different in character. Flatter, hotter. Duh. Mangrove-lined shores of Tabasco and Veracruz feel ancient in a different way from the highlands. Not ancient like stone temples, but ancient like the earth itself, like deep geological time. The Gulf of Mexico is warm and shallow and biologically rich, and from altitude, you can sometimes see the color gradients in the water where warm and cooler currents meet. In certain lights, the Gulf turns the most extraordinary shades of green and blue simultaneously, like something a painter invented. And then the Yucatan Peninsula, which belongs to neither coast in the usual sense because it is surrounded on 3 sides by water, the Gulf to the west, the Caribbean to the east. Flying the length of the Yucatan is one of my quiet pleasures. The geometry of it from above, flat, green, pocked with the gray-blue circles of cenotes, has a meditative quality. And then you cross the eastern coast, and there it is, the Caribbean. And I want to tell you something about the Caribbean from altitude, because I'm not sure enough people understand this. The water. The color of the water off the Caribbean coast of Mexico, off Cancun and Playa del Carmen and Tulum and the Riviera Maya, is not a natural color. I mean, it is natural, obviously, but it looks designed. It looks chosen. The combination of shallow limestone shelf, white sand seafloor, and crystal-clear tropical water produces a blue that ranges from the palest turquoise to the deepest cobalt within the span of a few kilometers. From altitude, you are looking at what appears to be someone's very ambitious idea of what the sea should look like, and it is entirely extravagantly real. I need to tell you about the volcanoes. I have been circling the subject, and now I must address it directly. Popocatépetl, Popo, as the Mexicans call him with the casual affection you give a dangerous old relative, is one of the most active volcanoes in North America. He stands at 5,426 meters. He has a near-perfect conical shape that makes him look from the air like a child's drawing of what a volcano should look like. When he is fuming, which is often, there is a visible plume rising from his crater. On approach to Mexico City from the east, you sometimes pass quite close to him. I have seen his plume at my altitude. I have seen his crater glowing at night. I have on one memorable occasion flown through a light ash fall from him on departure from Mexico City, which required an immediate change of course and a somewhat creative conversation with a TC. He is not simply a geological feature to the people of the surrounding towns and cities. He is, and has always been, a being. The Aztecs knew him as a warrior god. There is a legend, one of the most beautiful in Mexican mythology, I think, that tells of Popocatépetl as a warrior who loved a princess named Teotihuacan. She died believing him dead in battle, and he, returning to find her gone, carried her body to a mountaintop and knelt beside her in eternal vigil. And that is what you see when you look at the two volcanoes from the Mexico City basin. Iztaccíhuatl, whose silhouette looks, they say, like a sleeping woman, and Popocatépetl, kneeling beside her still smoking with grief or fury or love. I have told that story over the PA system on more than one approach into Mexico City, when visibility was good enough to see both mountains clearly. The cabin always goes quiet. To the east, Pico de Orizaba, Citlotepetl, Star Mountain, in Nahuatl, is the third highest peak in North America and the highest point in Mexico. I have a photograph taken from my left cockpit window on a clear February morning of Pico de Orizaba. Emerging from a perfect ring of cloud, its glacier-capped summit brilliant white against a blue sky of almost absurd intensity. That photograph sits framed in my office at home. People ask me where it was taken, and when I say Mexico, they always seem surprised. They always seem to think of mountains as a Swiss or Himalayan thing, not a Mexican thing. Mexico, I remind them, has more than 300 peaks over 3,000 meters. It is an intensely, primordially vertical country. Let me talk for a moment about what flying over Mexico has taught me about history. Real history, I mean, not the version you get from a textbook, but the version you understand when you have spent decades observing this country from above and below. The Spanish conquest of Mexico, the defeat of the Aztec Triple Alliance by Hernán Cortés and his indigenous allies between 1519 and 1521, is one of the most consequential events in human history, not just for Mexico, for the entire world. The silver that flowed from Mexican mines in the centuries that followed financed European empires, sparked inflation across the global economy, funded wars and artworks and philosophical revolutions. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the old world and the new, transformed human diets, human populations, and human landscapes on every continent. Mexico was the hinge on which much of that exchange turned. From the air, you can see the archaeology of conquest in the urban plans of Mexican cities. The Spanish built their colonial cities on top of indigenous ones, often quite literally. The Cathedral of Mexico City stands on the foundations of the great temple of the Aztecs, the Templo Mayor, excavated only in the late 1970s after a construction worker accidentally broke through its walls. The Zócalo, the main square of Mexico City, is one of the largest public squares in the world, and it sits exactly where the ritual heart of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec island capital, built on a lake that no longer exists, once beat. The lake is gone. Drained by the Spanish, who didn't understand or didn't care how the Aztecs had engineered their relationship with the hydrology of the Valley of Mexico. The city sinks. It has been sinking for centuries because it was built on the soft lakebed sediments. The Cathedral of Mexico City, begun in 1573, completed more than 200 years later, tilts visibly. Different parts of it sink at different rates because they were built at different times into different depths of the old lake bottom. It is a Baroque masterpiece in slow motion collapse, and it has been that way for 400 years, and it is still standing. Mexico specializes in that kind of resilience. Let me tell you about flying at night over Mexico City. I know I keep returning to the city, but it deserves the attention, and then some. Night approaches in the Mexico City on a clear night, coming in from the south over the mountains. This is one of the signature visual experiences of my career. You cross the mountain ridge and the city appears below you all at once, because the geography is like pulling back a curtain. One moment you are over dark mountain terrain. The next moment there are 20 million lights stretching to every horizon. The city is orange and white and bright, a constellation that has fallen and spread itself across a valley. The highways trace luminous lines through it. The airport, when you find it, is a small dark rectangle in the middle of all that light. You are aiming for the dark spot in the sea of brightness. I have done that approach many dozens of times, and it has never, not once, been routine. What I think about, in those moments, is not the technical challenge of the approach, though that deserves respect, but the lives. The 20 million lives burning down there. The woman heating water for a tolle at 3 a.m, the taxi driver navigating the Periferico, the students in Tlatelolco, the families in Iztapalapa, the old man in Teotihuacan sitting in the blue light of a television. They are all down there, all real, all present in the glow. And I am carrying 300 and something people in a metal tube through the thin air above them, responsible for every one of those 300 lives with the full weight of what that means. And somehow in the midst of all that professional gravity, there is still room for pure awe. That is what 30 years in this seat has taught me more than anything else. You do not lose the awe. If you do it right, if you stay paying attention, you do not lose it. A few surprising facts, because I collect them, and because Mexico deserves to be surprising. Mexico City is the oldest continuously inhabited city in the Americas. Tenochtitlan was founded, according to Aztec tradition, in 1325, and the city has been occupied ever since, through conquest and colonial rule and independence and revolution and earthquake. 700 years, more or less, of continuous urban life on that lake bed. Mexico is the world's largest producer of avocados. That may sound trivial until you consider the scale. Mexico produces roughly 30% of all the avocados consumed globally, mostly from the state of Michoacan, and the industry is worth billions of dollars annually. From the air over Michoacan, the avocado orchards make the hillsides look like deep green velvet. Mexico has the second largest population of Spanish speakers in the world. After, well, there is some debate about whether it's actually second or third, depending on how you count Colombia and the United States, but by any measure, it is one of the great Spanish-speaking nations. But it is also home to 68 officially recognized indigenous languages and hundreds of distinct dialects. Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, is still spoken by more than 1.5 million people. Mayan languages are spoken by millions more. The linguistic diversity of Mexico is, like its biological diversity and its culinary diversity, a form of wealth that cannot be quantified in GDP. Speaking of biological diversity, Mexico is one of 17 so-called megadiverse countries in the world, nations that together account for the majority of the Earth's species. It has more reptile species than any other country. More than 200,000 different species call Mexico home. Flying over the cloud forests of Chiapas, or the tropical dry forests of Jalisco, or the mangroves of Sinaloa, you are flying over living libraries of evolution, millions of years of biological complexity compressed into the landscape below. The Mexican gray wolf, the lobo, was extinct in the wild within Mexico for decades. Reintroduction programs have brought it back. Small numbers of them are out there somewhere in the mountains of Chihuahua and Sonora. I find that fact disproportionately moving. I don't know why exactly. Something about persistence. Something about the idea that what seems lost is not always gone. We are beginning our final descent now. The Mexico City basin is ahead of us, the mountains rising on 3 sides, the city spreading across the valley floor in the afternoon haze. I've been doing this long enough to know exactly what the approach checklist feels like. Exactly how the conversation between the first officer and I will go. Exactly how the aircraft will respond as we slow through the different flap configurations. After 30 years, much of this is muscle memory. But the view is never muscle memory. The view demands to be seen fresh every time. I have been asked, over the years, what my favorite country to fly to is. It's an impossible question, honestly. Every country has given me something. Japan gave me precision and ceremony. Brazil gave me scale and chaos and beauty indistinguishable from madness. Morocco gave me a sense of standing at the edge of 2 worlds. India gave me the overwhelming, vertiginous sensation of human civilization in its most extreme expression. But Mexico. Mexico gave me a 30-year education in what it means for a place to have survived. The indigenous civilizations that shaped this land were not erased by conquest. They were driven underground, and then they grew back around and through what had been built over them. The Mexican national identity is not Spanish and not indigenous and not the result of the revolution of 1910. It is all of these things simultaneously, braided together, arguing with itself, producing something that is entirely and unmistakably itself. I can see that from up here. That is perhaps the greatest gift of this work, the perspective, the ability to look at a country as a whole. The mountains and the deserts, and the cloud forests, and the cities, and the ruins, and the crops, and the roads, and the coasts. All at once, all visible, all part of the same living entity. You understand connections from altitude that you can't perceive on the ground. You understand that the Aztec farmer's milpa in Morelos, and the Maya fisherman's, cenote in Yucatan, and the Zapotic weaver in Oaxaca, and the engineer in Monterrey, and the street vendor in Mexico. City are all part of the same geography, the same deep narrative, the same restless, volcanic, magnificent place. The wheels are down. Mexico City is coming up fast. On your right side, if you're looking, you may be able to make out the mountains to the east. And if the clouds are cooperating today, you might just see Popo, still smoking, still watching over the valley, the way he has been doing since long before any of us arrived. And the way he will be doing long after all of us are gone. Mexico, it never gets old. After 30 years, it never ever gets old.